Hi, this is Mr. Evans. I'm going to try and keep this video to 10 minutes. It is my updated tips 2025 on how to approach the AQA GCSE Business exam. My tips here come from teaching this for quite a while. Also reading the examiner's reports in detail. I have no affiliation with AQA, the exam board, anymore, although I did used to mark their A-level papers. Nevertheless, my tips here are coming from a lot of thinking about how to answer the exam, how to interpret the examiner's reports each year. First thing to draw our attention to is the grade boundaries. So to get a 7 last year, you needed 65%, all right? So that is about 6 out of 9 in the 9 marker. And to get a 4 is 44%. Okay, so you do not have to answer the questions perfectly. But what I will say is to keep an eye on time and make sure you finish the exam. Do not write too much. Okay, aim to write in the space that they give you. They always say students who use extra pages rarely gain extra marks. Okay, so keep an eye on time, finish the exam. On average, it's 1 mark every 1.16 minutes, but if you can save time on the shorter questions, it gives you time for those longer questions. And I absolutely recommend plan your answer to the long questions before you answer it. Okay, and I'll talk about that in a second. I forgot to add that to my tips. Okay, so tip number 2 is answer the questions in order. Okay, so that means starting with section A, starting with the multiple choice questions. Okay, never leave a multiple choice question blank. I see this in mocks every year where students leave a question blank. I'm sure their thinking is, I'll come back to that at the end of the paper when I've had to think about it. Never do that, because the end of the paper is an hour and 45 minutes later, you will have forgotten. So how do you deal with a multiple choice question you don't know the answer to? Just erase any wrong answers and guess, and move on to the other questions in section A. The priority with section A is to get all of the marks. The second priority is to answer it as quickly as you can, because these don't involve a case study that you've got to read. So try and answer section A to get all the marks, but secondly, try and pick up a little bit of time which you can use later on when planning those long questions which requires you to read the case study. Okay. Right, use the STEM in 6 and 9 mark questions. So this document here is the examiner's report from last year. It says a STEM is given for the 6 and 9 mark questions. This is used to help students focus their responses. Many students are not using this STEM effectively. In particular, responses to evaluative questions could have used the STEM to consider the most important factor. Okay, well, let's have a look. So I recommend answering the question in order, because the inclination might be to finish section A and then jump straight to the 12 mark question because it's the biggest question. Of course, you can do that, it's your exam, but what you might miss out on that is important information in the case studies that are presented before. So absolutely a bad way of doing it is to answer question A and then answer the 2 9 mark and the 12 mark questions, because it doesn't work with the exam. You've got to read the case studies in order. So of course, you do what you want in the exam, but I recommend reading the case studies and answering in order. On the 9 mark questions, it says that the examiner's report says use the STEM. The STEM is this little sentence here. Okay, it gives you some important information which the examiner said you can use in your conclusion, basically. Okay, so this one says since premium motorcycle 10 years ago, it's expanded slowly using organic growth. And you've got to think to yourself, well, what's the examiner trying to tell me here? In my view, it's saying they've expanded, that's the key bit of information that I'm going to want to draw on in my conclusion. And the question is whether they should now take over LLC, give reasons for your recommendation. Okay, so in terms of structuring a 9 marker, right, AQA have said this, in every examiner's report for as long as I can remember. There is no need for students to analyse the advantages and then a second paragraph on disadvantages and a third paragraph as a conclusion. Okay, this has been communicated in previous reports. You can see it there. That's not my advice. This is AQA. Now, AQA are a bit frustrating because they've said this in over many years, but then this is an answer that they've released as an example of a nine-mark response. Now, you can absolutely pause the video and read it. Okay, it's for a paper 1 2022 question, but you can see they've got a paragraph on pros, a paragraph on cons, and then a relatively short conclusion, which seems to go against everything that they say in the examiner's reports, which is to focus on one detailed paragraph and then have a detailed conclusion. So I think what we can take away from that is that there is a lot of freedom in how to answer the questions. My advice for the 9-marker is that you do a detailed paragraph on pros and cons. You're trying to pick up your application and analysis marks. And how do you know whether to do pros or cons? You just read the case study and decide if you've got more pros or cons. Okay, you then have a brief, however, and then a conclusion. Okay, so to answer a good conclusion, the two essentials in red here is that you answer the question and you justify your conclusion using the case study. AQA have said they'd like to see something a bit different, not just repeating prior arguments. But these are the bread and butter. Last year, the average marks in the 9-marker, these are the two 9-markers in paper 2, 4.71 and 3.99. So students aren't doing these perfectly. If you get 5, you're getting above the national average. Okay, and a very solid conclusion will simply answer the question and justify it using the case study. However, if you want to push on, there's a couple of methods you can use. You're not going to use all of these, but one method you could use is you could answer the question, justify your answer using the case study, and offer a problem with your solution, a problem with your recommendation, but say why, despite that problem is there, you think it can be solved, or you think that still, despite that problem, your conclusion stands. You can say what your conclusion depends on, or from the start of your conclusion, you can say, well, in the short term, we've got these benefits, but in the long term, we've got these costs, and therefore, overall, if the business is taking a long-term view, they shouldn't do it. Okay? So that's that. The 6 markers, okay, also have a stem. Let's get the 6 marker up. Here it is. Okay, and you're supposed to read it. In this case, the STEM mentions a new induction training program, new induction training. Okay, why have they got it? To ensure a high level of customer service. Okay, so that's going to be what I mentioned in my 6 marker, this high level of customer service. I go back to the case study and I find the key term in the case study, new induction training program. My application is going to be based around these bullet points here. Okay, so look for the key term in the case study. There's going to be application points around there. In terms of answering a 9-marker, it's always one benefit, one cost, one impact. The 9 markers are not answered well. Last year, the average marks in the 9-marker were sort of 2.95. One of them, in paper 2, the average mark across the country is 2.12. So if you're getting 3, 4 marks, you're above the national average. All right. And we're focusing on explaining 1. All right. It is difficult to do it. It's worth remembering there's 3 application marks, 3 analysis marks. So very simple way of working out whether you've done it. Right. 1 paragraph focused on 1 impact. Try and use the case study 3 times to explain what that is. Okay. And then you'll do pretty well in your 6 marker. Okay, the 4-mark questions have got 2 knowledge and 2 application marks. So you can simply define a key term, show knowledge, and then explain why that's relevant to the case study using application. And again, if there's 2 application marks, aim for 2 specific bits of application from the case study. The 4 markers tend to come up in section C. Okay. All right, and what we see is section B is information about business. Section C has got some information about our second business. All right, and then we flick through it. There's our 6 markers. There's a second case study, blah, 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 all about the second business, and our third case study. And our third case study is what our 12 marker is based on. So this is why I recommend not going straight for the 12 marker, okay? Because you need to read, to do really well in the 12 marker, it's best if you've read all of that. So don't recommend skipping straight to it. Okay, key thing about the 12 marker, the average is 5.28. So again, not particularly well answered. In the 12 marker, every time you've got 2 options, option 1, option 2. You need a paragraph on each of them. Your paragraph can either focus on pros or cons, it doesn't matter. And I recommend a brief however at the end. So if you focus on, if you've done the bulk of the paragraph on cons, have a brief however, the pro of option A, pros, cons, option B with a brief however. Okay, so just to be really clear here, I'm not saying you do pros and cons. You do detailed pros, the con is the however, or you do detailed cons with a pro as a however. That gets you to show both sides of the argument. This is advice, AQA, so you just need 2 detailed paragraphs. So in other words, you could do a paragraph entirely on cons with no however and still get the marks. For a conclusion in the 12 marker, you're going to say which one and why not the other option, and that's it. Okay, in as much detail as you can using the case study. The final thing I say about the 12 marker is they can be really difficult, right? So this one says Anita wants to improve the productivity of all employees quickly. Okay, and then she gives you 2 options. You need to analyse the effect of these 2 options on all employees. So that's your paragraph. How do these things affect employees at Phone Limited? And then the recommendation is which one should they introduce first to improve the productivity of all employees in the short term. Okay, so there's an awful lot there. You need to have your highlighter, you need to read the question carefully, and you need to refer back to the question as you're reading the case study to make sure you're answering it. Good luck in your exams. Hopefully that was helpful.